The words, spoken in a tone of finality, meant to be both a judgment and a dismissal, carried across the gilded ballroom with the chilling clarity of breaking glass. "Nobody wants her." Lady Ashworth, her stepmother, delivered the line to a circle of nodding matrons, her fan hiding a smile that did not reach her eyes. From her position near a marble column, Elara felt the heat of 100 gazes, a sudden, suffocating wave of public pity and private scorn. Her former fiancé, as of an hour ago Lord Ashworth, stood beside his new, wealthier prize, refusing to meet Elara's eye. Her life, meticulously managed and quietly propped up by her own unrecognized efforts, had just been dismantled on the polished parquet floor. The world shrank to the sound of her own breathing and the rustle of silk as people shifted to get a better view of her humiliation. And then a different sound. The solid, measured tread of polished leather on marble. A silence fell in his wake, a ripple of quiet deference that followed him as he moved through the crowd. He was a man who seemed to carve his own space from the very air, a figure of stark black wool and uncompromising stillness in a sea of colourful frippery. The Duke of Blackwood. A name whispered in drawing rooms, a man of immense wealth and influence, known for his reclusive nature, and a past scarred by a tragedy no one dared mention aloud. He stopped directly before her, its presence a sudden, formidable shield against the prying eyes. He was taller than she had imagined, his face a composition of severe lines and shadows, his eyes the colour of a winter sky. He had not been expected to attend. He had not been seen at a London gathering in a decade. He looked not at her face, but at her stepmother, his gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the smug satisfaction on her features. Then his eyes returned to Elara. They held no pity, no warmth, nothing she could easily name. There was only a cool, unnerving assessment, as if he were examining a piece of machinery for its utility. "Lady Ashworth is mistaken," the Duke said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the residual whispers with absolute authority. He extended a gloved hand to Elara. It was not a gesture of courtship, it was a gesture of transaction. "I want her." The declaration was not romantic. It was factual, delivered with the same intonation a man might use to claim a winning card at whist. He did not wait for her to process the shock. His hand remained, steady and expectant. For a moment she could only stare at the fine black leather, at the stark, impossible choice it represented. Behind her lay public ruin and a life of dependent misery. Before her stood a man who was a mystery, a fortress of solitude offering a different kind of cage. But it was a cage of her own choosing. She placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, impersonal, and secure. He did not smile. He simply turned and led her from the ballroom, the crowd parting before them like water before the prow of a ship. The great oak doors closed behind them with a soft, final thud, shutting out the gasps, the whispers, and the entire world she had ever known. A new, silent one awaited. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of love found in the most unexpected of places, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The story of Elara and the Duke is only just beginning. Her life before the Duke had been one of careful, thankless competence. She was the ghost that kept Ashworth Manor from collapsing under the weight of her father's indolence and her stepmother's ambition. Her father, Baron Ashworth, was a man whose title was his only remaining asset, a gentle but weak-willed figure who had long ago ceded control of his home and his children to his second wife. Lady Ashworth ruled with a velvet glove over an iron fist, her pronouncements on fashion, society, and household economy treated as law. Elara, the daughter of the first wife, was a constant, inconvenient reminder of a past her stepmother wished to erase. She was quieter than her step-siblings, plainer, and possessed a mind for figures that was deemed unladylike. While her stepbrother, Thomas, was praised for the estate's sudden solvency, it was Alara who spent her nights in the cold estate office, a single candle guttering as she pored over the ledgers. It was she who found the pilfering steward, she who renegotiated the tenant leases, she who discovered a forgotten tract of timber that could be sustainably harvested to pay down their most pressing debts. Her work was absorbed into the family's recovery without a word of credit, her insights presented by her stepbrother as his own flashes of brilliance. Her engagement to Lord Ashworth, no relation, a coincidence of name that had once seemed auspicious, had been her own strategic move. He was a man with a respectable title and dwindling finances, and she knew her modest dowry would be insufficient. So she had prepared a portfolio, a detailed accounting of her family's estate that showed its potential for future growth under sound management, her management. She had presented it to him not as a bride-to-be, but as a silent business partner. He had been impressed by the numbers, if not by her. The marriage was a contract, a means to secure her family's future and her own escape from her stepmother's quiet tyranny. She did not expect love. She expected a partnership based on mutual interest. It was a cold comfort, but it was a solid one. She believed in the integrity of a well-drafted contract. It was a language she understood far better than the coded pleasantries of the drawing room. For 2 years the arrangement held. The wedding was planned, the announcements made. Alara allowed herself a sliver of hope, a quiet belief that she was building a life on a foundation of her own making, however sterile. She did not love Lord Ashworth, but she respected the bargain they had struck. She believed he respected it too. It was her first and most devastating miscalculation. The world she was about to learn did not run on the logic of ledgers. It ran on greed and opportunity, and she had just become a liability. The betrayal, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a series of quiet, deliberate cuts. It began with whispers she overheard between her stepmother and her lady's maid about the immense fortune of a Miss Althea Redding, newly arrived in the county. Then came Lord Ashworth's increasingly frequent absences, his excuses vague, and his manner distracted when he did call upon her. Alara, who could read a balance sheet and spot a discrepancy from 20 paces, saw the emotional accounting with perfect clarity. A new, more valuable asset had come on the market. Her own value was in steep decline. The end came in her father's study, a room that smelled of stale pipe smoke and resignation. Lord Ashworth stood by the window, refusing to look at her. Her father sat behind his desk, studying his own hands. Her stepmother, however, was radiant, her face alight with triumph. "Lord Ashworth has come to an understanding," she announced, her voice smooth as cream. "His affections and his future lie with Miss Redding, a most sensible match." The dissolution of the engagement was framed as a kindness, a mutual agreement to part ways. Alara was offered no chance to speak. The contract she had so carefully constructed was torn up, its terms rendered meaningless by a more profitable offer. She looked at her father, searching for a flicker of protest, of paternal defense, but he would not meet her gaze. In his silence, she understood the totality of her abandonment. She was not his daughter. She was a failed investment to be written off. The public humiliation at the London ball was her stepmother's final, masterful stroke. It was not enough to be discarded. She had to be seen as worthless, ensuring no other respectable family would have her. She was to be returned to Ashworth Manor as a spinster, a permanent dependent under her stepmother's thumb. As she was packing her trunk for the season, the one person in the house who had ever shown her genuine kindness, a young housemaid named Anna, slipped into her room. Anna pressed a small, lumpy bundle into her hand. "It's not much, miss." she whispered, her eyes full of fear and sympathy. "Just a few shillings I saved. For something." Ilara had clutched the small purse, the weight of the coins a tiny, solid proof that she had not been entirely invisible. It was the only farewell she received. The journey to London was a blur of misery, culminating in that gilded ballroom where her value was publicly declared to be nothing. And then, the Duke of Blackwood, a man made of winter and iron, had stepped out of the shadows and named his price. His offer was not a rescue, it was an acquisition, and for a woman who had just been declared worthless, being seen as a commodity was a terrifying, breathtaking relief. It was a language she understood. It was a contract. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a profound and unnerving silence. Ilara sat opposite the Duke, the plush velvet of the seat a stark contrast to the rigid set of her spine. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather harnesses were the only sounds. He did not speak, did not even look at her. He simply stared out the window at the darkening countryside, his profile carved against the fleeting landscape like a figure on an ancient coin. He was not a comforting presence. He was a formidable one, radiating an aura of contained power and a deep, unbreachable solitude. Ilara watched the reflection of his face in the glass, trying to decipher the man who had plucked her from social ruin. There was nothing to read. His expression was a mask of cold neutrality. She was a problem he had solved, a piece moved on a board. The transaction was complete. There was no need for pleasantries. As they passed through imposing iron gates and began the long drive towards the house, she saw it for the first time. Blackwood Manor was not a home, it was a fortress. It rose from the earth in great, dark blocks of granite, its lines severe and its windows like watchful eyes. It was a place built to withstand a siege, both from without and within. The great hall was vast and cold, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the vaulted space. A woman stood waiting for them, ramrod straight, her grey hair pulled into a severe knot. She was dressed in black bombazine, a chatelaine of keys at her waist, jingling softly as she curtsied. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as crisp as autumn leaves. "Mrs. Gable?" The Duke acknowledged with a slight nod. "This is the Duchess. See that she is made comfortable." He did not introduce Ilara by name. He introduced her by her new title, her new function. Mrs. Gable's gaze swept over Ilara, a quick, thorough inspection that missed nothing, from her simple travelling dress to the exhaustion in her eyes. There was no welcome in her expression, only a reserved, professional assessment. "A room has been prepared in the West Wing, Your Grace. A maid has been assigned." "Very good," the Duke said, already turning away. "I will be in my study." And with that he was gone, his footsteps receding down a long, dark corridor, leaving Ilara alone with the formidable housekeeper. The promised maid appeared, a young woman named Mary, with wide, observant eyes and a quiet demeanour. She led Ilara up a grand, cold staircase, their path lit by sconces that cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The silence of the house was absolute, a living presence. It was the silence of a place long accustomed to being uninhabited. Later that evening, a footman summoned her to the Duke's study. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with books, the only warmth coming from a low fire crackling in the hearth. The Duke stood by the fire, a glass of dark liquor in his hand. He gestured for her to sit in a leather armchair. He did not sit himself. He preferred to stand, to command the space. "We should be clear on the terms of our arrangement," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are now the Duchess of Blackwood. This title affords you my protection and the resources of this estate. You will have a generous allowance, access to my accounts for the management of the household, and you will want for nothing in a material sense. Your duties are simple. You will be the mistress of this house. You will manage the staff and the domestic budget. You will, on the rare occasions it is required, act as my hostess. You will present to the world the image of a respectable, stable marriage." He took a sip from his glass, his eyes fixed on the fire. "What I will not offer," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming harder, "is companionship. I do not require a confidant. My life, my work, and my history are my own. You will have your wing of the house, and I will have mine. We will share a breakfast table for appearances, but our evenings will be our own. I do not expect affection, and I will not offer it. Is that understood?" It was the most honest speech she had ever heard from a man of his station. Cold, yes, brutal even. But it was clean. There were no hidden clauses, no sentimental lies. It was a contract. "Perfectly," she said, her voice steady. He finally looked at her, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, in his winter-grey eyes. He had expected tears or protests. He had not expected calm, unequivocal acceptance. "Good," he said, turning back to the fire. "Then we shall have no trouble." She rose from the chair. In that moment she felt a strange sense of peace. The active, smiling cruelty of her past life had been replaced by a cold, honest indifference. And indifference, she knew, was survivable. It was a foundation, however cold, upon which she could build. In the first weeks, Ilara moved through Blackwood Manor like a ghost, learning its rhythms and its silences. The house was a monument to order and neglect. The floors were scrubbed, the silver polished, the linens perfectly laundered, yet there was no life in it. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the heavy draperies of unused drawing rooms. The staff, led by the watchful Mrs. Gable, moved with a quiet efficiency that bordered on invisible. They were polite, correct, but distant, their loyalty belonging solely to the Duke and his solitude. Ilara did not try to charm them. Instead, she began to work. Work was the only thing she trusted. She requested the household accounts from a reluctant Mr. Thorne, the estate steward, a man who clearly resented her presence. She spent a week in the small, cold office allocated to her, poring over years of ledgers. Just as she had at Ashworth Manor, she found the story written in the numbers. Wastefulness, complacency, contracts with suppliers that had not been renegotiated in a decade. She began quietly. She started with the kitchens, speaking with the cook about the exorbitant cost of produce from a London supplier. She found a local farmer who could provide fresher goods for half the price. She reviewed the stable accounts and found they were paying for fodder for horses that had died years ago. She addressed the drafty servants' quarters by hiring a local glazier to repair the windows, paying him from the savings she had already made. Mrs. Gable watched it all, her expression unreadable. But one afternoon, as Ilara was reviewing a new contract for beeswax candles, the housekeeper entered her office with a tray. On it was a cup of tea and a small plate of shortbread. "You look tired, Your Grace," was all she said. It was the first gesture of kindness Ilara had received. Her relationship with Mary, her personal maid, deepened in small, quiet ways. Mary never filled the silence with idle chatter. Instead, she seemed to know what Ilara needed before she asked for it: a warm shawl, a book left by the bedside, the curtains drawn just so against the morning light. She was a calming, steady presence, a silent ally in the vast, empty house. Ilara's greatest discovery was the gardens. Tucked behind the west wing was a series of walled gardens that had once been magnificent, but were now lost to a wilderness of weeds and overgrown brambles. An ancient glass house stood with half its panes shattered, and the stone paths were obscured by moss. She found the head gardener, a man named Mr. Abernathy, whose age was impossible to guess, quietly tending a small patch of herbs near the kitchen door. He told her the gardens had been his late mistress's pride, the first Duchess, and had been left to ruin after her death. The Duke could not bear to look at them. Elara saw not a memorial to a dead woman, but a challenge. She put on a pair of old work gloves she found in a potting shed and began, one small section at a time, to pull weeds. Mr. Abernathy watched her for a day, then two. On the third day he appeared at her side with a spare trowel and a wheelbarrow, and they began to work together in companionable silence. The Duke watched her. She would feel his gaze from the window of his study, which overlooked the gardens. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would find him in the library. It became their unspoken meeting place. They would sit in chairs on opposite sides of the hearth, each with a book, the only sounds the rustle of a turning page and the crackle of the fire. They rarely spoke more than a few words, a simple "good evening," a comment on the weather. But the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the strained, empty silence of the carriage. It was becoming a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the other's presence. One night he looked up from his book and saw the dirt smudged on her cheek, which she had missed when washing. He said nothing, but a strange, unreadable expression crossed his face before he looked back down at his book. The fortress of Blackwood Manor was still cold, still silent, but Elara was slowly, methodically, planting seeds of life in its forgotten corners. And its master, against his will, was beginning to notice. The library was Elara's sanctuary, a world of leather and paper that smelled of time and quiet contemplation. It was in the library that she began the monumental task of cataloguing the Blackwood collection, an effort no one had undertaken in half a century. Mr. Thorne, the steward, had sneered at the idea, calling it a lady's frivolous pastime, but the Duke had given his curt approval. It was while searching for a misfiled folio on agricultural yields in a dusty, forgotten corner of the archives, a small, cramped room adjoining the main library, that she found it. Tucked behind a row of crumbling estate maps was a heavy leather-bound ledger, locked with a small brass clasp. It was not part of the library's collection. It was personal. Curiosity, a trait she usually suppressed, got the better of her. The lock was old and simple. Using a letter opener from a nearby desk, she carefully worked it open. The book fell open to a page of neat, precise figures. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a private accounting of debts held by the Duke, and the first name on the page was her father's, Baron Ashworth. She scanned the entries, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The Duke of Blackwood was not just a creditor to her family. He was their only creditor. He had systematically, over the course of the previous year, bought up every single one of her father's outstanding notes and mortgages. He owned Ashworth Manor, lock, stock, and barrel. He had held the power to ruin them, to cast them out onto the street at any moment he chose. But it was the dates that turned her blood to ice. He had purchased the final, largest portion of the debt on the very day her engagement to Lord Ashworth had been publicly announced. The implication was as clear as it was monstrous. He had not simply stumbled upon her in that ballroom. He had laid a trap. He had watched her family's decline, armed himself with the means of their destruction, and waited. He had waited for her to be cast off so he could acquire her, a distressed asset, for the price of a carriage ride home. Her competence, her work, her quiet efforts to restore his home, it all felt like a sham. She had not been building a new life. She had been performing the duties of a well-chosen servant, one he had procured with cold, financial precision. That evening she did not wait for their usual silent communion by the fire. She took the ledger and walked directly into his study without knocking. He looked up from his desk, his expression hardening at her intrusion. She placed the open ledger on the polished wood between them. "Explain this," she said, her voice low and shaking with a cold fury she had not known she possessed. He looked down at the page, then back at her. For the first time since she had met him, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, looked unguarded. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, weary resignation. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "That is not an explanation." She shot back. "Did you orchestrate my ruin? Did you buy my family's debt so you could purchase me like a piece of livestock when the price was low enough?" He did not flinch from her accusation. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out into the blackness. "I did not orchestrate your ruin," he said, his back to her. "Your family and Lord Ashworth managed that on their own. But I did anticipate it." He turned to face her, his expression stark in the lamplight. "My agents have interests across the country. They brought the Ashworth estate to my attention as a potential acquisition. When they did, they included a report on its management. They spoke of the Baron's son, Thomas, who was credited with its sudden improvement. But the numbers, the strategies, they were too clever, too meticulous for a boy like him. I had them look deeper. They found it was you. You were the one holding it all together." He paused, his gaze intense. "I saw in you a competence, a character that is exceedingly rare. I knew a man like Lord Ashworth would never value it. I knew he would discard you the moment a more profitable offer appeared. So yes, I bought the debt. It was leverage, a tool to ensure that when he cast you aside, I would be there to offer you something else. Not a cage, Alara. A fortress." It was the first time he had used her name. The honesty in his voice was as brutal and unadorned as the terms of their original contract. He had not trapped her. He had, in his own cold, calculating way, rescued her. The discovery that should have shattered her trust instead laid a strange, new, and terrifying foundation for it. The fragile peace forged by the Duke's confession was soon tested. A carriage bearing the crest of Lord Ashworth arrived one morning, unannounced. Alara was arranging flowers in the great hall when the butler, with a look of profound disapproval, informed her of the visitor. Lord Ashworth swept in, all false smiles and concerned condescension. He had aged in the few months since she'd last seen him. His face was puffier, and there was a frantic, desperate edge to his eyes. His new, wealthy wife, it was rumoured, was proving to be far more astute with her fortune than he had anticipated. "Alara, my dear," he began, reaching for her hand. She stepped back, putting the vase of white roses between them like a shield. "I have been so worried, kept here in this mausoleum with that brute. No one has seen you. Society fears the worst." "I am not being kept, my lord," she said, her voice perfectly level. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood. This is my home." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. A title bought to cover his perversions, no doubt. Everyone knows of his reputation. He is a monster. But it is not too late. I am prepared to overlook your lapse in judgment. I will rescue you from this place." At that moment, the Duke appeared on the grand staircase above them. He descended the stairs slowly, his tread silent on the marble. He did not look at Ashworth. His eyes were fixed on Alara. He came to stand beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He said nothing, offering no defense, no threat. The choice, his posture communicated, was hers. It was a transfer of power, enacted in the charged silence of the hall. This was the moment Alara found her voice. Not the quiet, competent voice of the ledger books, but a voice of cold, clear command. "There is nothing to rescue me from, Lord Ashworth," she said, looking him directly in the eye. "You seem to be operating under the misapprehension that I am a possession to be claimed. I am not. My previous life, including our unfortunate association, was a business arrangement which you saw fit to terminate. I have entered into a new one. I find its terms far more agreeable." Ashworth's face mottled with rage. "You were nothing before me, a spinster with a failing estate. He has bought you, and when he tires of you, he will discard you just the same." "The difference," Elara said, the words like chips of ice, "is that this is a house where my work is valued. I am not a decoration here. Now, if you do not leave, I will have you removed. The Duke values his privacy, and I have come to value it as well." For the first time, Ashworth seemed to shrink, to see her not as the girl he had discarded, but as the woman who stood before him, the mistress of a powerful and intimidating house. He looked from her resolute face to the Duke's stony silence. He had lost. With a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed out, the great oak doors closing behind him with a boom that echoed through the hall. Elara stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. She had not looked to the Duke for help. She had not needed it. When she finally turned to him, she saw a crack in his stone-like composure, an expression of profound, unguarded respect. They were not savior and rescued. They were allies. In the days following Ashworth's visit, a new and unfamiliar tension settled between them. It was not the cold distance of their initial arrangement, nor the quiet coexistence of the library. It was something more charged, a silence filled with unspoken thoughts. They were partners who had faced a common enemy, and the shared victory had changed the very air in the house. One evening, Elara could not settle. She abandoned her book and walked out into the gardens. The moon was high and full, casting the newly cleared paths and budding rose bushes in a silvery light. She had worked tirelessly with Mr. Abernathy, and the garden was slowly breathing back to life. The scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine hung in the cool air. She heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her and turned to see Alistair. He wore no coat, only his shirt sleeves, and he stopped a few feet from her, his hands in his pockets. "I often wondered if these gardens would ever live again," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "They needed tending," she replied simply, turning back to look at a trellis where she had staked a climbing rose. "Everything does." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the moonlight filter through the leaves. "Thank you," he said finally, "for how you dealt with Ashworth. He was a loose end from a previous account," she said, falling back on the language of ledgers. "It needed to be closed." He took a step closer. "He was not the only ghost in this house, this garden. It was my first wife's. Amelia. She was full of life, like this place once was. She filled this house with laughter and music and people." His voice was flat, a recitation of facts, but the pain beneath it was a chasm. "And she filled it with lies. She betrayed me with my closest friend in this very house. When she died, I let the garden die with her. I locked away the entire east wing where we lived. I preferred the silence. I preferred the cold. It was safer." Elara listened, her heart aching for the profound, lonely grief he had carried for so long. She understood now the fortress he had built around himself, the cold, hard terms of their contract. They had been for his protection, not just hers. "I decided," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "that if I were ever to marry again, it would be a transaction. I would seek competence, not charm. I would value utility, not beauty. I would find a woman who would not fill my house with lies." He turned to face her fully, his eyes dark pools of moonlight and shadow. He looked at her hands, which were not the soft, pale hands of a lady, but were calloused and sometimes smudged with dirt from the garden. "I was a fool," he said, the words devastating in their simplicity. I sought an arrangement and found a partnership. I sought competence and found character. I sought a quiet house and found a home. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently took her hand. His touch was warm and firm, a stark contrast to the cold night air. He did not pull her closer or say anything more. He simply stood there, holding her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. And in that quiet, moonlit garden, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of new life, the wall of stone he had built around his heart finally, irrevocably, crumbled to dust. To silence the rumours Lord Ashworth had begun to spread in London, and to formally introduce his Duchess to society, Alistair announced he was reinstating the annual Blackwood Gala. It was an event the Ton had not seen in a decade, and the invitations were coveted like royal commands. For weeks the manor was a hive of activity, but it was a joyful, purposeful energy, not the silent, hollow routine of before. Ilara oversaw every detail, not as a hired manager, but as a true mistress of the house. She worked with the cook on the menu, with Mrs. Gable on the staff assignments, and with Mr. Abernathy on the floral arrangements, which were to come exclusively from their own restored gardens. On the night of the ball, she stood beside Alistair at the top of the grand staircase, greeting their guests. She wore a gown of midnight silk, a colour that mirrored the depths of his eyes. It was simple, elegant, and utterly confident. She was not the terrified, humiliated girl from that other ballroom. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she had earned her place. The ballroom, which had been shuttered for years, was ablaze with the light of 1,000 candles, the music of the orchestra swelling to fill the vast space. Ilara moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, Alistair always near. She spoke of crop yields with a country squire, of French poetry with a dowager countess, and of investment strategies with a London banker, her knowledge and composure earning her nods of surprise and respect. The whispers that had followed her for months died out, replaced by murmurs of admiration. Of course, Lord Ashworth was there. He had secured an invitation through a distant cousin, his face a mask of sour resentment. He found his moment when Ilara was momentarily alone near the terrace doors. "Quite the performance," he sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You play the part of the Duchess well, but we both know what you are. A glorified housekeeper he bought for a pittance." Before she could respond, Alistair was there. He did not touch Ashworth. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood beside Ilara, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying with perfect clarity in a sudden lull in the music. "I believe you are confused. A housekeeper is a paid employee. My wife is a partner, an invaluable one." He turned his address to the wider circle of onlookers. "Many of you have wondered at the sudden revival of this house. Let me be clear." He looked at Ilara, his expression one of public, unequivocal pride. "The Duchess has, in less than a year, renegotiated every supply contract for this estate, saving us 30%. She has audited and reorganized the tenant leases, increasing their yield and their fairness. She has personally overseen the restoration of the Blackwood Gardens, which many of you are enjoying tonight in these arrangements. This house was a shell. She has given it a soul." He raised his glass. "The world values women for their beauty and their bloodlines. I have learned to value them for their character and their brilliance. To my wife, Ilara, the Duchess of Blackwood, the architect of my home." The entire room, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted in applause. Ashworth's face was a study in humiliation. He turned and fled, disappearing into the crowd, a man finally and completely ruined by the woman he had so foolishly discarded. Alistair took Ilara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They were no longer just allies in private, but partners in the full, bright glare of the world. A year had passed. It was a bright morning in early summer, the kind of day where the sunlight seemed to have a tangible warmth and weight. The formal dining room at Blackwood Manor remained mostly unused. Instead, Elara and Alistair took their breakfast in a small glass-walled sunroom she had reclaimed from a storage space, a room that overlooked the now thriving gardens. The scent of roses and freshly cut grass drifted in through the open doors. The table between them was small and intimate, laden with a simple meal of fresh eggs, toast, and coffee. The silence was no longer a void to be endured, but a comfortable, shared peace, punctuated by the rustle of a newspaper or the clink of a spoon against china. Alistair passed her the marmalade, his fingers brushing against hers, a casual touch that sent a familiar, pleasant warmth through her. It was in these small, unremarked moments that the truth of their lives was written. The grand pronouncements and public validations were behind them. What remained was this: the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built together. Mr. Abernathy believes the climbing roses on the south wall will reach the roof by next year, she said, smiling. He is insufferably proud of them. He has every right to be, Alistair replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled back at her. As do you. He folded his newspaper and set it aside, giving her his full attention. The cold, severe Duke of Blackwood was gone, replaced by this man whose face was softened by a love he no longer guarded against. The fortress had become a home, its walls no longer meant to keep the world out, but to keep their shared life in. He had unlocked the east wing months ago. Together they had walked through the dusty rooms, and he had spoken of his past without the sharp edge of pain, but with the quiet melancholy of a healed wound. They had decided to turn the rooms into a nursery. The narrator looked upon them, these two people who had begun as a transaction, a solution to a problem. He, a man betrayed by passion, had sought a wife of pure function. She, a woman discarded as worthless, had sought only a safe harbor from cruelty. They had signed a contract of cold indifference and, in the process of honoring its terms, had violated every single one. They had offered companionship. They had shared their pasts. They had, against all logic and expectation, found love. After breakfast, they walked out into the garden. The air was warm, alive with the hum of bees. Alistair reached for her hand, his fingers linking with hers in a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. They stopped by the central fountain, which now splashed merrily, its stone basin cleared of moss and debris. He looked not at the garden, but at her, his winter-grey eyes full of a summer's warmth. All of this, he said, his voice quiet. It was all just a place. You made it a home, Elara. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We made it a home. The final image was not of a duke and his duchess, but of a man and a woman standing in a garden they had brought back to life together, their hands linked, a silent testament to the idea that the most profound partnerships can begin with the most honest of transactions. Thank you for watching until the very end. We have to ask, would you have trusted him when you discovered his secret? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us where in the world you're joining us from. Remember, the best alliances often begin when we least expect them.